We're looking at the silver chair today, and so I'm going to have to reverse what I said last class, which is that we are finished with Narnia. We are not finished with Narnia, but we are going to do the silver chair, which is the penultimate book in the series, second last, for those of you who don't do Latin. And one of my favorite books, and it does actually still touch on many of the themes that we have already seen in the series. In fact, it begins, and I have mentioned it a few times, the beginning of it, because I didn't realize that I had an opportunity to do the silver chair. So I mentioned the fact that it begins with, once again, one of these horrid schools. So let me begin with that and with Lewis's commentary on that. So we have two protagonists here in this one, Jill Pole and, of course, our friend Eustace Scrubb. Now, Eustace, if you recall, went to a progressive school. We met him in the first lecture I did on the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I did them out of order because I wanted to illustrate some of the things we'd been talking about previously in the abolition of man and connect it with his idea of also of the, not just the Tao, but the whole cosmology from the discarded image. But we could have just as easily have chosen the silver chair. And I'm going to talk about the silver chair today. And in some ways, it's illustrating the same thing as powerfully, if not more powerfully. It begins behind the gym. Now, the gym, when Lewis writes on schools, he is always thinking about what he discussed in the abolition of man. So the tendency of modern progressive education to promote a sort of equality everywhere and to inculcate chestless individuals. And it partly does it by means of a dereliction of responsibility by the teachers. It allows the children to have more authority. Lewis doesn't regard this, as much as the children will like it, as helpful to the children, because it is asking for responsibility from people who've not yet reached the years according to which we actually can charge them with being responsible. They're minors, right? So the law understands a certain age of majority, and with that, culpability for actions, right? And the actual age varies in accordance with different laws, but it's somewhere in the 16 to 18-year-old range. You know, the vote, there's pressure amongst progressives to lower that age. And of course, the contemporary sex ed curriculum talked about consent, and it was teaching the doctrine, or at least the word consent, to 6-year-olds. And I argued in print that the problem with that is that they have no understanding of what consent actually means, at least the full implications of it. I mean, yes and no, everyone understands that. You don't actually need to be told that. But the moral responsibility and the consequences of actions, that you can't grasp that as a 6-year-old. And if you could, then we would also hold children responsible for their actions, you know, for murder or various other things. But we don't, because they haven't yet developed their chests, actually, interestingly. So modern sex ed is a piece with progressive education in general, in the sense that it never fosters the sort of maturity that will be required of its citizens, and opens itself up to the conditioners. But the story here begins behind the gym. Lewis hated phys ed, in part because he was no good at it. I think he had, rather than 2 joints in his thumbs, he only had 1. So you can imagine, if that's the case, that you can't do very well in sports. At least nothing that's going to involve, I mean, if you were a runner, I guess it wouldn't affect you too much. But anything that involves the sort of games that are played in British public schools, rugby or cricket or that sort of thing, you're not going to do very well with thumbs that can't really grasp the same way. I'm not sure if I'm right about that, but I believe I read that in a biography. I didn't even know that until recently. But it was a dull autumn day, begins the silver chair, and Jill Pole was crying behind the gym, and she was crying because they'd been bullying her. They. This is not going to be a school story, so I shall say as little as possible about Jill's school, which is not a pleasant subject. It was co-educational, a school for both boys and girls, what used to be called a mixed school. Some said it was not nearly as mixed as the minds of the people who ran it. Of course, Lewis himself would be amongst them. These people had the idea that boys and girls should be allowed to do what they liked. And unfortunately, what 10 or 15 of the biggest boys and girls liked best was bullying the others. All sorts of things, horrid things, went on which at an ordinary school would have been found out and stopped in half a term. But at this school, they weren't. Or even if they were, the people who did them were not expelled or punished. The head said they were interesting psychological cases and sent for them and talked to them for hours. And if you knew the right sort of things to say to the head, the main result was that you became rather a favorite than otherwise. Now, anyone who's been in the public school system will recognize that this is exactly what goes on in the schools now, in the public schools, whereby the worst behaved children are actually treated the best, and the best are in many ways bullied by the others, often. But it's not always the best, sometimes it's just the weakest. But at any rate, the bullying goes on. And the reason that the bullying goes on is because those in authority exercise no discipline, even though that's their responsibility as adults. But if you have a resolute model of equality and you're creating people who will be without chest, then you yourself will be without a chest if you are a teacher. And in fact, if anyone requires you to have a chest, you will be howled at for daring to impose your authority on others. A model of education. Now, this contradicts the whole classical and Christian history of education, which is that of, again, being a role model and insisting on a pattern of behavior that you model, but the head here does not model the behavior and in fact regards people who are bullies as interesting psychological cases. And any child who's got half a brain, and not even half a brain is necessary for this, will be able to manipulate the head in this situation. So pretty soon the biggest bullies in the school run the school. And this is popular in, you watch movies these days and how school happens and how you've probably experienced it. This is actually what happens. You call your teacher by their first name. Adults do the same thing. They want to be friends. Lewis will talk about this as well when we come to the four loves. And one of the attractions here is that of the inner ring, and the belief that you are helping people by including them in the inner ring, as if by not making a distinction, say, between an adult and a child. Or in this case, he also notes between males and females. So education historically that it was sexually segregated. Not because they were worried about sex per se, but rather that the children themselves would be require different sorts of education. So I've looked into this a little bit. I'm no expert on it. But even things down to the mode of education matters. So boys tend to be more energetic and they want to get up and run around more. They don't do well sitting down for lengthy periods of time. It's just, they're boys. The educational establishment regards them as defective girls and gives them a chemical to calm them down. Boys also prefer to have the temperature should be a little cooler. So there's all sorts of differences in the whole setup. When you get them into grades 6 to 8, girls who develop a little bit sooner are very self-conscious and interested in what the boys are doing. And the boys have no interest in what the girls are doing, by and large, which disturbs the girls. But all the same, there's a lot of, and for the sake of the girls, it's actually helpful to segregate them from the boys, at least for that period. Anyway, there's a great deal of stuff that could be said about this, but even if you're going to dispute some of those points here, the point here is that they're all thrown together without discrimination, because discrimination, of course, is evil. And it would involve a differentiation between people. They weren't all equal, they weren't all the same. And of course, the biggest problem for that is in relation to the Tao, because the Tao involves a hierarchy. There's a right and a wrong. These are not just two different things. They're one that's correct, the other is incorrect. There's truth, there's falsehood. There's good, there's evil. That hierarchy doesn't fit with the male and female, by the way. But if you look at modern literary theory, it does, just because there's a binary. So they're species of the same thing. But there'd be an adult and a child. If you treat children like adults, you take away adults' responsibility, and you give children something that they're not able to exercise. At any rate, all of this is going on in a progressive school, and why she is crying is because she's being bullied, and she hasn't finished her cry. And around the corner comes who other than Eustace Scrubb. Now, when she meets Eustace, she's horrified, one, because she's embarrassed about the fact she's crying, and another because she's had a bad experience with Eustace in the past, and thinks, uh-oh. And then Eustace reminds her that he has been different recently, the whole term, in fact. And he has done various things that have demonstrated a very different character from the old Eustace. And she admits that this is the case. He's even been tortured, he says, by the bullies. And the bullies used to like Eustace, and now they don't. So within the school, there are divisions there, even though everyone is being treated the same and everyone is able to do what they want. Within the school, we find that there's a group that will not let others do what they want. So the adults seem open to the idea of allowing everyone to do what they want. But allowing everyone to do what they want means that those who are bullies will not allow others to do what they want. So effectively, it undermines the whole project anyway. Again, Lewis is subtly presenting, I think, what anybody observes who is in that situation. There ends up being a hierarchy there anyway in a school. And the hierarchy, though, is of the worst ruling the roost. Illustrates what he talked about in the discarded, or rather the abolition of man. But he begins with this, and what's interesting is that when Eustace points out to Jill that he's now a different boy than he used to be, and she acknowledges it after he gives her some peppermints and stops crying and so forth, a kind thing. Eustace would never have done that in the past. He then explains that he introduces the idea of a place that he had gone to with others. What does he say? Well, let me read a line that demonstrates what I was saying about the conditioners and the effect. It's not only that you've changed, says Jill. It's not only me. Everybody's been saying so. They've noticed it. Eleanor Blackiston heard Adela Pennyfather talking about it in our changing room yesterday. She said somebody's got hold of that Scrubb kid. He's quite unmanageable this term. We shall have to attend to him next. Eustace gave a shudder. Everyone at Experiment House knew what it was like being attended to by them, and it's in italics, them. In other words, the bullies are going to make an example of him. We can't manage him. So again, the freedom that the children have to do whatever they want results in the worst characters removing any freedom from anyone who actually exercises it outside of the dominant group. So Lewis is making subtle comments about human nature and its depravity when it's not checked by the Tao. But then she asked, why were you so different last term? A lot of queer things happened to me in the halls, said Eustace mysteriously. Well, what sort of things? Eustace didn't say anything for quite a long time, and then he said, look here, Pole, you and I hate this place about as much as anybody can hate anything, don't we? I know I do, said Jill. Then I really think I can trust you. Damn good of you, said Jill. Yes, but this is a really terrific secret, Pole, I say. Are you good at believing things? I mean, things that everybody here would laugh at? I've never had the chance, said Jill, but I think I would be. Could you believe me if I said I'd been right out of the world, outside this world, last halls? I wouldn't know what you meant. Well, don't let's bother about worlds then. Supposing I told you I'd been in a place where animals can talk and where there are enchantments and dragons and, well, all the sorts of things you have in fairy tales. Scrubb felt terribly awkward as he said this and got red in the face. How did you get there? Said Jill. She also felt curiously shy. The only way you can. By magic, said Eustace almost in a whisper. I was with 2 cousins of mine. We were just whisked away. They'd been there before. Now that they were talking in whispers, Jill somehow felt it easier to believe. Then suddenly a horrible suspicion came over, and she said, so fiercely that for the moment she looked like a tigress, if I find you've been pulling my leg, I'll never speak to you again. Never, never, never. I'm not, said Eustace. I swear I'm not. I swear by everything. Now, in brackets, when I was at school, one would have said, I swear by the Bible. But Bibles were not encouraged at Experiment House. All right, said Jill, I'll believe you. And tell nobody, and what do you take me for? Okay, so then he explains. And they go to a place, and within the context of Lewis's, here's my comment on this. Lewis is talking about the function of story. And he's also using story, remember, in response to this debate with Elizabeth Anscombe, where they're talking about miracles and debating miracles and the reality of miracles and so forth. Lewis, rather than arguing it again in a debate context, is now demonstrating the power of miracles by the means by which he most intimately understands them, that is through the power of stories. Remember at the outset I said that Lewis was opposed by B.F. Skinner. He called him the foremost representative of the literatures of freedom and dignity. He called it freedom and dignity, interestingly. And he said this is the very thing that we oppose. We want to get rid of the idea of freedom and dignity. Why? Well, the one resists conditioning, and the other, the Tao, does not conform to conditioning. So the 2 points, freedom and dignity. And with dignity, I think he means a moral absolute that isn't subject to the scientist. And so interestingly, the scientist, B.F. Skinner, the psychologist, the behaviorist psychologist, is on the side of the conditioners that are in the school as well, and with the bullies at that, just like the head of school. So the first point. So he begins with that, yet story is a way that Eustace transformed, and Lewis believes that stories have this ability. Because I talked about moral example. We have moral examples in our lives. There are people here. But for Lewis, here's the problem. The adults around him are not really very good examples of this. Maybe not so many. Maybe even the school he was in, the head there where he hated some of the schools, he met very few good, mature adults. But he did meet them in stories. And he loved the stories. And the reason he found the world so difficult is people acted and behaved better in the stories than they did in real life. Is that because he was living in unreality, or they were? Lewis knew what the answer was. Pardon me for this. Sorry, my basement flooded for the 5th time yesterday. Yeah. So story has had a profound effect for Eustace. Now remember, I say this because we've already done the last battle, and we've looked at what Lewis said about the relation of the old Narnia to the real Narnia. The old Narnia is effectively stories that in some ways approximate or at least anticipate heaven. There's something true and good and beautiful about great stories. All good stories. And there's certain things that are archetypal even, although Lewis isn't a fan of the archetypal approach per se, that Jordan Peterson is, for instance. Thinks that there's too many details that are left out of that, and I agree with that assessment. There are certain common themes in stories, there's no doubt about it, and that's why they are so recognizable and powerful, and the archetypes are there, but there's more than the big picture. There's also the small details, and we'll look at some of the small details here. But that story had transformed Eustace, and he says, would you want to go there? And then at that point she agreed she would like to go there, and at that point he suggests that they try and make it happen, and she's very excited, and she thinks that what are we going to do? Are we going to draw a circle in the ground and write queer letters in it and then stand inside of it and that sort of thing? And his response is, well, after he thought hard for a bit, I believe that was the sort of thing I was thinking of, though I never did it. That was the sort of thing I was thinking of back then, but I never did it. But now that it comes to the point, I have an idea that all those circles and things are rather rot. I don't think he'd like them. It would look as if we thought we could make him do things. But really, we can only ask him. Okay, so again, he introduces the idea of power and the importance of coming at things in the right way. And this is going to have a very important connection with the use of magic. Remember back when we said at the very outset, actually it was in The Magician's Nephew in particular, the apple, which could have healed his mother, little Diggory. It was a magical apple. It could have healed her body, but it would have done terrible things because it would have coerced. It would have had a power so that there was a necessity about it. And Lewis is commenting on the effect or the type of magic that modern science does. It coerces an outcome. It tries to bring everything under our control. Lewis sees this as very problematic because people are themselves problematic. We are not gods. We're corrupted. Christians would say by sin, and Lewis would agree. There is magic, but magic needs to be accessed in the right way, and the right way is to ask him. Right? So it's not doing incantations, it's not even think about how the magician Uncle Andrew uses their rings. How does he understand his magical power? Well, he experiments on others. You kids, try this. He uses guinea pigs first. Now let's try some human subjects. The question is asked to him, why don't you do it, Uncle Andrew? You know, if you're so brave, well, those standards don't apply to me. The right and wrong, you're judging me as being a coward, well, those don't apply to me because I'm a scientist, don't you know? And again, all of these are comments on what Lewis is observing, not just in the abolition of man, but observing throughout his fiction. It's a regular, consistent theme, and it's tied in with the education system. So with that, he says, well, we just call him Aslan, and then they call upon him, and at that point, a gate appears. They hear the bullies coming, and they go to the gate, and they get through the gate. Now, when they get through the gate, they find themselves on the top of very high mountains. This is how the whole novel, The Silver Chair, begins, right? So they're up on a very high mountain, and so high, dizzying heights, that it is terrifying. And Jill is being rather naughty and probably not believing where she is. It's not entirely clear, but maybe she just thinks it's a dream and that she can't fall to her death, whereas Eustace is terrified because he knows that in Narnia, believing it's real, that it is possible for people to die and that he could die there, and so he's very wary, just as he would be in our world, about falling off a very high cliff. And she plays with it, and then eventually he does fall, and of course then Aslan blows him away and he goes to a place where he can see the king of Narnia. And then there's an encounter on the mountain between a lion, Aslan, and Jill. And that encounter is really interesting. Because first of all, he checks her for what she did. So at the end of that, Jill is given a task, it says in chapter 2. And she cries, and at that point, hears the sound of running water, and she's very thirsty. It says she's dying of thirst, and the lion says, then drink. And she asks him to go away. I'd like the water, but I don't want you. In other words, she wants to control the situation and to control him. And he won't have it. So this is a testing point here. Lewis's understanding of the nature of God is that he does not coerce. There has to be a voluntary consent. On the other hand, it says in the same story, she says, we didn't call you, and he says, if I had not called you, you would not have called me. Right? Very explicit. So the idea that they got in their own heads, which they thought there was own idea to call upon Aslan, was actually Aslan calling them to this place for this purpose. The subtle connections between our sense of free choice and God's, you could say predestination, but certainly his vocation, his calling, is played here. And he's also touching on the fact that it's not coercive. There's a necessary laying down of all coercion on this. So God doesn't work, prayer is not a means of forcing God's hand. You don't put in the penny or whatever and get a certain outcome there. It doesn't work that way. But she's dying. Would you mind going away while I do drink from this water? And the lion answered this only by a look and a very low growl. And then whenever he does that, it's watch out. And as Jill gazed at his motionless bulk, she realized that she might as well have asked the whole mountain to move aside for her convenience. Now, this is very interesting. Even the comparison here, because I'm going to ask the question, what is this mountain? What does it represent? The delicious rippling noise of the stream was driving her nearly frantic. Will you promise not to do anything to me if I do come? Said Jill. I make no promise, said the lion. Jill was so thirsty now that without noticing it, she had come a step nearer. Do you eat girls? She said. I have swallowed up girls and boys, women and men, kings and emperors, cities and realms, said the lion. It didn't say this as if it were boasting, nor as if it were sorry, nor as if it were angry. It just said it. I daren't come and drink, said Jill. Then you will die of thirst, said the lion. Oh dear, said Jill, coming another step nearer. I suppose I must go and look for another stream then. There is no other stream, said the lion. It never occurred to Jill to disbelieve the lion. No one who had seen his stern face could do that, and her mind suddenly made itself up. It was the worst thing she had ever had to do, but she went forward to the stream, knelt down, began scooping up water in her hand. It was the coldest, most refreshing water she'd ever tasted. You didn't need to drink much of it, for it quenched your thirst at once. Before she tasted it, she had been intending to make a dash away from the lion the moment she had finished. Now she realized that this would be, on the whole, the most dangerous thing of all. She got up and stood there with her lips still wet from drinking. Come here, said the lion, and she had to. She was almost between its front paws now, looking straight into its face, but she couldn't stand that for long. She dropped her eyes. "Human child," said the lion, "where is the boy?" "He fell over the cliff," said Jill, and added, "Sir." She didn't know what else to call him, and it sounded cheek to call him nothing. "How did he come to do that, human child?" "He was trying to stop me from falling, sir." "Why were you so near the edge, human child?" "I was showing off, sir." "That is a very good answer, human child. Do so no more. And now," the boy is safe, I've blown him. Now, but she doesn't tell him. He doesn't tell her, rather, the outcome until the point at which she tells him the truth. And that's her test, just like it was with Diggory. How are you going to respond here? Are you going to trust with no promise of an outcome whatsoever? Are you, that moment, you can't manipulate the situation. It's not within your power. In fact, there's no possibility of it. It's purely faith at that point. And she's pushed to it. Note that she's moving to, as he speaks to her, she draws near to him. He's come to her, she's drawing near to him. And eventually she makes that decision. At that point, he reveals to her that he has called her out of her world for a task, which she finds incredible, because they made that choice. And then the famous line, "Then you are somebody, sir," said Jill. "I am." So that, which anyone who's attuned to Scripture will recognize as God's words in Exodus and Jesus' words as well. Before. And now hear your task. And then he gives the task. And the task then is signs. And there are 4 signs that he's going to give. And she is to remember them. Because when she leaves the mountain and goes back down to Narnia, now Narnia, of course, is a place, an enchanted place, but he says, when you go from here down there, you will find that the air is more, what's his word for this? Yeah, it doesn't say, or I can't find it. It's more confusing in any way. It's less clear. The air is less free, and it's less. Her mind will be less. More. So remember the signs, and then that will lead you forward. And if you do so, then you will be able to succeed in your quest. But you have to remember the words, because when you go down there and you see things with your eyes, you will not recognize them. So you must remember. So what is being said? So this is my thought here. They're on the mountain. There could be many mountains. If you're thinking scripturally, it could be the Pisgah mountain, the mountain on which Moses is standing when he looks to the promised land. He can't go there. That's not the mountain. It's not that mountain. It could be the mountain of the Lord, on which all the faithful are. The faithful are described as that mountain. I don't think it's that mountain either. I think it's the mountain where Moses receives the 10 Commandments, or Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, because the two are parallel passages. When Jesus sits down in front of the 5,000 with the Beatitudes and so forth, the Sermon on the Mount, he is effectively acting like God, teaching his people now directly, as opposed through a mediator, Moses. And so the words that he uses are important. They need to be remembered, and they need to be remembered in order to be guided in the ways of this world, which are deceptive, even in Narnia. Note that he says that he calls her, and he says, "You would not have called to me unless I had been calling to you," said the lion. So the importance of the word in being able to see. This is really interesting. And Lewis is saying something here about the status of revelation as well. Now, I wanted to emphasize that because this is also an aspect of the conditioners. The conditioners recognize no words, no doctrine that is not amenable to reasoning and to empirical evidence. Remember, they invert reason and understanding. So that reason is now the dominant faculty, and even our terms of understanding are submit to reasoning. And there's nothing left that can be self-understood. And Lewis says if there's nothing that is self-understood, then we debunk absolutely everything, then there's nothing left to debunk. So reason by this account is not the faculty that Lewis regards as helpful, like the charioteer driving the two beasts. It's a charioteer without a chariot. There's nothing left. It's the means of actually bringing about men without chests. Reason itself. Not bound by any terms of understanding that the angels themselves require in order to think. Certain self-understood things, axioms which are necessary for philosophy to actually even function. And above all that, the importance of revelation. So this is what he's establishing here on the mountain. What is absolutely necessary for you to reason rightly and to act rightly is to acknowledge the truth of revelation. And this is what Aslan is doing here. This is how you will... So these are not just human words. These are not subject to change. This is the way it is. Lewis is making a comment about the primacy of certain words, in particular God's words, it seems to me, here. Maybe I'm going too far, but I don't think so. So then he blows her there, and they land there, in Narnia, and they see Prince Caspian, and of course they don't recognize him because, of course, 70 years have passed, and as Aslan had said, things will not appear as they are, but he is to greet the first person he sees as an old friend. And he says, well, I don't recognize anything. Well, after he's gone, he realizes it's been 70 years since he last was there. And he forgot. Eustace forgot. But Jill didn't attend to the signs too closely. She didn't say, no, that is him. It must be, because Aslan said so. So even if your eyes deceive you, it is him. But then he gets away. So then they go on their voyage. Now, what's interesting in this, and this is Lewis's comment, and I find this fascinating, at a few points he says that if she'd obeyed earlier, that they would have been avoided certain things. They wouldn't have had to undergo the trials and the arduous difficulties that they have. So even though they disobey and they are wandering apart from the counsel that they've been given, and the counsel is also the Tao, by the way. Even though that is the case, that doesn't hamstring Aslan. So there is a rule and an order, and the Tao and even the heavens themselves have a certain moral order to them and an eternal order that speaks to the truth of things. That doesn't mean that God or Aslan can't operate outside of them, although it's in accordance with this. Remember, the nature itself is not an independent faculty. Actually, in the medieval conception, nature is everything that falls beneath the realm of the moon, if you recall. That's nature. What's above it is, or physis, from which we get physics. And everything beyond it's then metaphysics. And it accords with that. And those things don't change, whereas everything below the moon does change. So physics changed, but it still operates in accordance with the truths and unchangeable principles of metaphysics. Come Immanuel Kant, those get inverted. So when reason is above understanding, he says there is no more metaphysics. It's impossible. And he's correct if his turn is correct, which it isn't. But that's beside the point. I'm getting away from my topic here. So he blows her there. She gets there. They land there, and they meet a very strange group of individuals, one of them being an owl, Glimfeather. And there is a parliament of owls. Lewis is, by the way, throughout the whole story, so there's a parliament of owls. This is a play on words on Lewis's part. There's a famous little short topical poem by Geoffrey Chaucer called The Parliament of Fowls. So if you just put an F in there, or it sounds even, The Parliament of Fowls. And there are various birds there. It's unrelated to this, but I think Lewis has got that in his mind. The other thing he has in his mind, it seems to me, and it seems to me pretty obvious at various points here, is the Odyssey. The Odyssey is regularly a template for the structure of this whole story. There's a couple of illustrations. Some of these are really trivial. So when they go to the sailing of the king and they meet the dwarf Trumpkin, and he needs a horn. What is it? Not a horn, or is it a horn? In order to hear, a trumpet rather. So a trumpet to his ear, so he can hear into it. He mistakes them. And there was Caspian the 10th. And who are these? These are two strangers, my lord, said the owl. Rangers? What do you mean, said the dwarf. I see two uncommonly grubby man-cubs. What do you want? My name's Jill, said Jill, pressing forward. She was very eager to explain the important business in which they'd come. The girl's called Jill, said the owl, as loud as it could. What's that? The girls are all killed? I don't believe a word of it. What girls? Who killed him? Only one girl, my lord, said the owl. Her name is Jill. Speak up, said the dwarf. Don't stand there buzzing and twittering in my ear. Who's been killed? Nobody's been killed, hooted the owl. Who? Nobody. All right, you needn't shout. I'm not so deaf as all that. What do you mean by coming here to tell me that nobody's been killed? Why should anyone have been killed? Better tell him I'm Eustace. And of course he understands it's useless. But this play on nobody is what Odysseus tells what's his name? The giant Cyclops, Polyphemus, that his name's nobody. And then when he blinds him, he cries out, and the Cyclops run and said, nobody is killing me. And he said, well, if nobody's killing you, then there's no... So this is very silly and trivial. This is a small thing. The larger thing is the voyage that they undertake, and the voyage that they undertake is going to take them down in the underworld. And they're going to come up from there. But along the way, they encounter various other beasts, including man-eating giants. And in the Odyssey, there are these man-eating giants called the Lestrygonians or something like that. I'm not sure about the spelling here. But these are man-eating giants, just like we will encounter. Again, that's relatively trivial. The bigger point is that it does sort of structure the whole of the work. So I've got this from, once again, our friend from Planet Narnia. The structure of the Odyssey, it begins in Ithaca. So the Odyssey observation I'm not getting from him. The structure of the book I am, though. But the Odyssey begins in Ithaca with Telemachus, who's a boy who's left without his parents, interestingly. Who do we have here? We have children who are without parents. They're on their own. They don't know how to act. Who's going to lead them? Well, in the Odyssey, it was Mentor first. And then eventually, we then got back to another figure, Odysseus. And here we have these two figures that are going to be reunited, and then there's going to be a fight in the end. So we have now Jill Pole and Eustace Scrubb, and they're eventually going to meet Rillian, who's down in the underworld, and the two of them are going to have to fight their way out. Well, it's like Odysseus encountering his son Telemachus and them fighting side by side. But the structure of it begins in England and Aslan's country. Chapters 1 and 2, and it concludes in Aslan's country, England and Aslan's country, chapter 16. So it bookends it. So chapters 1 and 2, England and Aslan's country. I'll just put England and not the other one here for now. And chapter 16, likewise, England. And in the Odyssey, it begins again in Ithaca and it ends in Ithaca. And in between, chapters 2 to 9, we're in Narnia. And again, 15 and 16, we're in Narnia. And in chapters 10, or 9, even part of 9 down to 14. So 9 down to 14. We're in the Underland. And a glimpse down to Bism itself. right? So there's this structure of they go down, they come back up, but it's these parallels. Same thing in the Odyssey. Begins in Ithaca, it ends in Ithaca. Then they encounter the Phaeacians, and he tells his story, and within that story that he tells about his descent to the underworld, right in the center of chapter 11, I believe it is, in the Odyssey. And he needs to go down to the underworld in order to become the hero who he is. Now, in this case, the children are going to become heroes, develop chess by undergoing the same experience. And they're going to have to rescue a figure, namely, in this case, Rilian, from the work of the witch, who has him in the Lady of the Green Kirtle, who comes in the guise of a serpent, who bit his mother, and now she's serpentine. No, it's not the same figure as the white witch earlier. It's a different manifestation of evil. Here it's green. Here it's rather like revisiting Paradise Lost with a serpent in the garden, right? And she's bit. Lots of echoes all over the place, at any rate. Let me read one final thing, which I think is interesting and important. And this is, again, the discussion in Planet Narnia. He drew my attention to this, and I think he's entirely correct. Is the planet that most influences this story is the moon. Now, let me read this about the moon, and then you will see. Now, the moon is, in Latin, lunae. And, of course, the effect of being under the influence of the moon is lunacy. And, of course, Rilian is a patient on the silver chair, and he loses his mind. And then for 1 hour every 24 hours, he's trapped in this chair, and at that point he becomes himself, and he needs to be strapped into it. And then once that's over, then he goes back to being under the power and the enchantment of the Green Lady, whose design it is to, of course, invade the upper world and bring it under conquest. And how is she doing it? By means of her magic. What sort of magic is it? It's coercive. We find that the beasts, even of Abysm, do not want to do the evil deeds that they're going to do. They're all afraid, terrified, coerced. Same thing, by the way, in The Lord of the Rings. The servants of Sauron don't love Sauron. They don't freely offer service to them. They are coerced out of fear. But I'll read this, and this is from The Discarded Image. This is what he says about Luna, pages 108 and 109. At Luna we cross in our descent the great frontier which I have so often had to mention, from ether to air, from heaven to nature. Remember, everything above the moon is called heaven, and it's the realm of ether up there. But now we get back into the air. And note that the air goes all the way up to the moon, interestingly, in the medieval and ancient conception. From heaven to nature, from the realm of gods or angels to that of demons, from the realm of necessity to that of contingents, from the incorruptible to the corruptible, going down. So what happens in the planets above the moon is there's necessity. What happens below it is contingent. There's allowance for free will, by the way. There's no free will. Actually, there is free will even in the realm of necessity there. It's that everyone has chosen the good. There's no consequences of the fall. The fall, by the way, when it happens, it hits the earth and it affects everything all the way up to the moon. And that's why in the Lewis's sci-fi trilogy, we're on the silent planet, right? The voice of the Archon or the Oyarsa who rebelled no longer hears the voice of God. The equivalent there. But it says, unless this great divide is firmly fixed in our minds, every passage in Donne or Drayton or whom you will that mentions translunary and sublunary will lose its intended force. We shall take under the moon as a vague synonym, like our under the sun or everywhere, when in reality is used with precision. So to be under the moon is to be suffering doubt and uncertainty. I'll skip over the illustrations that he uses. It's the realm of mutability or change. and inconstancy and faithlessness, or the possibility of being faithless, whereas everything above the moon is faithful, ever faithful. The heavens themselves declare the glory of God. Here they'd understand that referring to the heavens above the moon, if you were in the medieval mindset. But she is in a mutable realm. And when Chaucer says, fortune may none angel dare in the Monk's Tale, he's remembering that angels inhabit the ethereal realm where there is no contingents and therefore no luck, whether good or bad. There's no possibility. It's just unchanging thing. Her metal, that is the moon, is silver. Silver chair. In men, she produces wandering, and that in two senses. She may make them travelers, so that, as Gower says, the man born under Luna will seek many lands strange. So he'll go on voyages. In this respect, this is Lewis's comment, the English and the Germans are very much under her influence. But she may also produce wandering of the wits, especially that periodical insanity which was first meant by the word lunacy, in which the patient, as Langland says, is mad as the moon sit, more, other, less. These are the dangerous, unsafe lunas of the Winter's Tale, etc., etc. The other thing that's marked by the moon is the influence of the moon. The influence of the moon does what? Well, if you've ever watched it, it has the effect of lunacy. It also changes the tides. And so the thing that we need to notice about the silver chair, which shows the influence of the moon, I don't think it's a dominant theme, by the way, but I do think there's something there. I think the themes that I've discussed are far more important, but I'll grant the planet Narnia, Michael Ward, that there is definitely an influence there. That in the very first page of the first chapter, when we meet Jill Poole, there's water mentioned everywhere. So she's crying on a damp little path. She is joined by Eustace, who sits down on, quote, grass that was soaking wet. We also read of drops that dripped off the laurel trees, that drip off the leaves, drops of water on the grass. Nothing of significance to the plot comes of these images, but they're beginning to create a definite atmosphere. In the second atmosphere, I'm just reading directly from him, by the way, Michael Ward. In the second chapter, water has a more obvious played a role in connection with Jill's tear and the stream from which she's desperate to drink. Now, the stream is the stream of living water here. It's not just any old water. She's desperately parched. She's going to die if she doesn't drink. That's right. There's a spiritual water which is being offered here. And then when she goes there, she is blown through the wet fogginess of a cloud, and she emerges, her clothes wet. She's splashed by a wave of the sea, drenching her nearly to the waist. Chapter ends with her exclamation, "How wet I am." Okay, so there's water everywhere. And he says it would be tedious to detail every other reference to water and wetness in the book, but it's worth remembering Jill's baths in chapters 3 and 8. Her wet pillow, the frequent rain, mentioned at least 6 times. Caspian's watery eyes, the fountain where William's mother met her death. The marshes in chapter 5 with their muddy water. The countless channels of water, and above all the suggestively named marsh wiggle, Puddleglum. Puddleglum belongs to a race who do watery work, and he himself is thrice described as a wet blanket. Okay. And of course, what's interesting about Puddleglum is he is a figure of constant faith. And the children revile him repeatedly, the wet blanket. His flesh supposedly tastes muddy. He cooks them eels right away, so he's a fisherman. He's also modeled, biographers will tell us, and actually I think Lewis's own son tells us that he's modeled after the gardener in the Lewis household. What was that man's name? Fred Paxton, who was an Oxfordshire common man, salt of the earth type individual. Consistently negative. And yet as loyal as they come and as trustworthy as they come and as straight as an arrow. They're very negative bent, and this man would have been named after him. Clearly, Lewis loved Puddleglum and loved the man after whose character was modeled after this man, Paxton. Remember, he wrote these not only for everyone but for his boys. So they would have recognized Paxton in Puddleglum, and they would have been chuckling. And Puddleglum's the great hero in the story. He's the one that breaks the spell. How does he break the spell? At cost to his own flesh. He steps on the fire of enchantment, right? And he burns his foot. So these are, connected with the Lunae was then the wandering. Well, these are the wanderings that take place here. And also remember, Odysseus is the wanderer. So I think that Lewis is just marrying different sources and connecting them in this way. So I'll grant, though, that there's something of the influence of the moon here and that it's important. When it comes down then to the underworld, and let me skip over huge sections here and get down into the realm of the underworld and Bism. I guess I should put that on here. Remember, this is a mark of an epic hero as well. To be able to go down, not only to go down there, because everyone goes down, it's the realm of the dead. In the Odyssey and in the Aeneid, going down into the deep depths. In Lewis's imagination, it's not so. On the contrary, it's just like it was in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. It's a place where those who love that world dig, like the dwarves. And they create fantastic things, and it's marvelous. And Rillian is so enchanted by the possibility of adventure, just like in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where Caspian wants to go to the end of the world and is having to be pulled back by his shipmates, saying, "You can't do that, you're the king." Likewise here, Rillian has to be checked from going down into the underworld and exploring, going on a grand adventure. That is not your path here. You are required to go back up to the land of Narnia where you are the king and reveal yourself. Anyway, section I want to come to here, in the bottom of the world, the healing of harms. Where is the queen and the silver chair and all that? So this is the Queen of Underland. Of course, the Queen of Underland happens to be the lady in the green kirtle. The lady in the green kirtle, who was in fact also the serpent that bit his mother, killed her and then enchanted him. How did she enchant him, by the way? This is interesting. It's not actually explained. Well, what is it that she did that brought him down into the underworld? Is it beauty? Because she's described as being extraordinarily beautiful. Was it the beauty of the lady? What was it? It was his grief at losing his mother again. Just like Lewis himself lost his mother, and Diggory almost lost his mother, the loss of a dear maternal figure renders him vulnerable. So she's almost a maternal figure to him. She promises that she's going to marry him. But in many ways, she is acting like a maternal figure. Now, if you were one of the sick biographers, you would read this as Mrs. Moore and Lewis's fetish love of this older lady that was in the house with him and all that sort of stuff, if you've read the biographies at all. Lewis looked after one of his friends who died in the First World War. They agreed that if one of them survived and the other didn't, that they would look after their respective parents as a dutiful and Lewis fulfilled his vow, looked after Mrs. Moore. Biographers suggest there was some sort of sexual relationship there, for which there's no warrant whatsoever. Warney denies it, but of course Warney would probably, so that's not necessarily reliable. But I find it disgusting and perverse and unwarranted and unimaginable. No man can write this literature with a clear moral compass and a clear moral understanding who has corrupted himself in that way. I don't buy it. I think it's manifestly repugnant. Is it unclear where I stand? I think it's absurd. There's no evidence whatsoever other than the supposition of other people, which is terrifically unfair. But in any event, here she has this power over him, and I think it might be something of that. But it's not clear how she bewitches him. But there's a repeated encounter with this lady, and eventually he finds himself in the underworld. And when he gets down there, he's now subjected to her magic. She brings him down to the underworld. So in a sense, he dies. Nobody knows where he is. That's where the story begins. Remember, Aslan says he's still alive, and yet nobody in the world knows where he is. Well, he's been gone for 10 years, in fact. Who else was gone for 10 years at the beginning of the Odyssey but Odysseus himself? Nobody knows where he is. Nobody's been able to make hide or tail of him. And until he returns, those who have lost him simply mourn and lament, and they can't get on with their lives. His father is desperate to find out what happened to him. So he's effectively dead. He's in the underworld. But really, he's not in the underworld, or rather, he's not dead. He's simply under the spell of the witch. And the witch is using this silver chair to keep power over him in some way. And the silver chair is connected to the moon and with inconstancy, but now it's coercive. And he only gets free from it, as I say, once every 24 hours from the spell. But the chair, which is silver, has connections with the moon, and it invokes a lunacy not while he's in the chair, but rather the rest of the time when he's out of it. Is it the chair of psychiatry as well? It's probably going a little far. But it is sort of a piece with what has been said earlier. I don't think there's any warrant to go exactly there to that extent, but I think there must be something there. The famous passage with the Queen of the Underland, let me deal with this. So when Rilian reveals to the children, in the name of Aslan, I adjure you, let me free, and then they recognize the sign, and it only comes because she remembered what the sign was. At that point, they then, against their own best counsel, free him. Why? Because it's actually Puddleglum that says that they should. Puddleglum, the pessimist. If that's the sign, then we have to. Oh, if we only knew, said Jill. I think we do know, said Puddleglum. Do you mean you think everything will come right if we do untie him? Said Scrubb. I don't know about that, said Puddleglum. You see, Aslan didn't tell Pole what would happen. He only told her what to do. That fellow will be the death of us once he's up. I shouldn't wonder. But that doesn't let us off following the sign. They all stood looking at one another with bright eyes. Why are they bright? Because they've got tears in them. It was a sickening moment. All right, said Jill suddenly. Let's get it over. Goodbye, everyone. They all shook hands. The knight was screaming by now. There was foam on his cheeks. Come on, Scrubb, said Puddleglum. He and Scrubb drew their swords and went over to the captive. In the name of Aslan, they said, and began methodically cutting the cords. The instant the prisoner was free, he crossed the room in a single bound, seized his own sword, which had been taken from him and laid on the table, and drew it. You first, he cried, and fell upon the silver chair. That must have been a good sword. The silver gave way before its edge like string, and in a moment a few twisted fragments shining on the floor were all that was left. But as the chair broke, there came from it a bright flash, a sound like small thunder, and for a moment a loathsome smell. "Lie there, vile engine of sorcery," he said, "lest your mistress should ever use you for another victim." Then he turned and surveyed his rescuers, and the something wrong, whatever it was, had vanished from his face. Now, I think Lewis is like Rillian when he goes after the false education. He's trying to destroy it. That's the silver. The silver chair is a way of making people think they're sane when they're mad. And then he comes to his own mind and so forth. "How long have I been in the power of the witch?" he asked. "It's more than 10 years since your highness was lost in the woods at the north side of Narnia." 10 years. 10 years. And then the queen comes down. And then they encounter her, and I'll get to that in a second. But you can see the parallels between the Odyssey and this, and I think in many ways also the prominence of trusting in Aslan's sign, very literally. Note that, and I don't obviously know what the character of the gardener was like, but the gardener was also a literalist. This is the sign. We don't know the outcome. We have to believe. We're not going to, there's no guaranteed outcome. In fact, by my lights, of course he's Puddleglum, we're all going to die. That doesn't matter. Again, that life and death choice was the very one that faced Diggory. If I do this, my mother is going to die. But if I don't do it, I won't be the boy that my mother raised me to be. And out of love for my mother and the tears that are dripping down Aslan's eyes, I'm going to trust that, irrespective of the outcome. So it's not, there's no guarantees. But this is acting in the right way. Now, when they get down to the Queen of the Underland, she comes in. She comes in with the two Earthmen. She says, "Leave us, and let none disturb us till I call, on pain of death." The gnomes padded away obediently, and the witch queen shut and locked the door. "How now, my dear Lord Prince?" By the way, just in terms of parallelism, she is a lot like Saruman here. Saruman, who also has a voice that bewitches and captivates. And remember, if you've read The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf warns, beware her voice. So it's not just the instrument of the silver chair. That is just one of her means of magic. The chief one is her false teaching and the enticing nature of the false teaching. It makes them want what she offers. It's if you're looking for a biblical example, it's there are two ladies in Proverbs 1-9. There's the lady of wisdom who speaks and offers good counsel, and then there's the adulterous woman who lures men to their deaths. She's like the latter here, but she does speak. So there's speech that goes with this, a doctrine. She says, "How now, has your nightly fit not yet come upon you, or is it over so soon? Why stand you here unbound? Who are these aliens, and is it they who have destroyed the chair, which was your only safety?" Prince Rillian shivered as she spoke to him. And no wonder. It is not easy to throw off in half an hour an enchantment which has made one a slave for 10 years. Then, speaking with a great effort, he said, "Madam," now note that. It wasn't just the magic. It was his mind, which had been formed by her lies. And that is not easily cast out. You don't just, even though he's been restored to his right mind, that doesn't mean that he's not still suffering the influence. And in fact, he is not going to be able to resist, even though he's the prince here. He's not the one who's going to be able to have the chest to resist the witch. It will be Puddleglum. But he says, "Madam, there will be no more need of that chair. And you, who have told me 100 times how deeply you pitied me for the sorceries by which I was bound, will doubtless hear with joy that they are now ended forever. There was, it seems, some small error in your ladyship's way of treating them. These, my true friends, have delivered me. I am now in my right mind, and there are two things I will say to you. First, as for your ladyship's design of putting me at the head of an army of earthmen, so that I may break out into the overworld, and there by a main force make myself king over some nation that never did me wrong, murdering their natural lords and holding their throne as a bloody and foreign tyrant. Now that I know myself, I do utterly abhor and renounce it as plain villainy. You can see by the light of the Tao that murdering people that never did him wrong is just that. I will not do such a thing. He doesn't know that he's their king per se, but I will do no such thing. And then second, now he does announce his specific identity. I know who I am. I am the king's son of Narnia, Rilian, the only son, only child of Caspian, 10th of that name, whom some still call Caspian the seafarer. Therefore, madam, it is my purpose. Maybe Caspian is actually the Odysseus, and this is the Telemachus. Therefore, madam, it is my purpose, as it is also my duty, to depart suddenly from your highness's court into my own country. Please it you to grant me and my friends safe conduct and a guide through your dark realm. Now note he's speaking with utmost courtesy. Earlier words, they were upbraided for, I think by Aslan, for using discourteous speech. Never curse. If you get the point where there's something that needs to happen, then use physical force, but use courteous speech. If they will not respond to courtesy, then force is what all you have available to you. But now the witch said nothing at all, but moved gently across the room, always keeping her face and eyes very steadily towards the prince. When she'd come to a little ark set in the wall not far from the fireplace, she opened it, took a handful of green powder. This she threw on the fire. It did not blaze much, but a very sweet and drowsy smell. Now then, she will start to dispute that there is such a place as Narnia. There is no such place. And that what she will employ at this point is variations on the arguments used for the kingdom of heaven, that it actually exists. Who's ever been there? Who's ever seen that? Have you been up there? There is no realm up above. The overworld. There's no sky. What or where, pray, is this? How do you call it? Overworld? Oh, don't be so silly, said Scrubb, who's fighting hard against the enchantment of the sweet smell and the thrumming. Note that there's music with it as well. As if you didn't know. It's up above, up where you can see the sky and the sun and the stars. Why, you've been there yourself. We met you there. I cry you mercy, little brother, laughed the witch. You couldn't have heard a lovelier laugh. I have no memory of that meeting, but we often meet our friends in strange places when we dream. And unless all dreamt alike, you must not ask them to remember it. Madam, said the prince sternly, I have already told your grace that I am the king's son of Narnia. And shalt be, dear friend, said the witch in a soothing voice, as if she were humoring a child, shalt be king of many imagined lands in thy fancies. We've been there too, snapped Jill. She was very angry because she could feel enchantment getting hold of her every moment. But of course the very fact that she could still feel it showed that it had not yet fully worked. And thou art queen of Narnia too, I doubt not, pretty one, said the witch in the same coaxing, half-mocking tone. I am nothing of the sort, said Jill, stamping her foot. We come from another world. Why, this is a prettier game than the other, said the witch. Tell us, little maid, where is this other world? What ships and chariots go between it and ours? Now note she'll be using the very same language the conditioners will in speaking about anything that is not empirically verifiable that they can see with their own eyes and ears. We're going to dispute that. She's enchanting them, but she's also arguing with them. And then in the end, it's all a dream. Yes, all a dream. There never was such a world, said the witch. No, said Jill and Scrubb, never was such a world. There never was any world but mine, said the witch. There never was any world but yours, said they. Puddleglum was still fighting hard. He's an adult. Got more of a chest. I don't know rightly what you all mean, and he also is logical. Right? in a way that the children are not. He will not deal in fiction. He sticks to the facts. I don't know rightly what you all mean by a world, talking like a man who hasn't enough air, but you can play that fiddle till your fingers drop off and still you won't make me forget Narnia and the whole overworld too. We'll never see it again, I shouldn't wonder. You may have blotted it out and turned it dark like this, for all I know, nothing more likely. But I know I was there once. I've seen the sky full of stars. I've seen the sun coming up out of the sea, and in the end. So it has an effect of his defiance. The others are cheered by it. They are roused from their sleep, and they breathed again. They looked at one another like people newly waked. Why, there it is, cried the prince. Of course, the blessing of Aslan upon this honest marsh wiggle. We've all been dreaming these past few minutes. So there are two dreams, two magics at work here. He only breaks it, and he said there never was a sun, etc. The sun is like Plato's allegory of the cave. You think that there's a sun, there's only a lamp there, and you have extrapolated from that and imagined that there's a realm outside of the cave in which we are. For the last few minutes, Jill had been feeling there was something she must remember at all costs, and now she did, but it was dreadfully hard to say it. She felt as if huge weights were laid on her lips, and at last, with an effort that seemed to take all the good out of her, she said, "There's Aslan." Aslan? Said the witch, quickening ever so slightly the pace of her thrumming. What a pretty name. What does it mean? It's the great line and so forth. Well, it's just a little cat. In the end, he has to stamp on the fire. And the burning smell of his flesh releases them from this. And of course, she's outraged by the act. But at that point, note that he can't argue with her anymore. He simply has to act, and he acts in accordance with the words that he'd already understood. Lewis is also making a point here that is consistent throughout his work. It's not enough to hold the right things, you have to act in accordance with them, and that will demonstrate that you've understood them. And the Marshwiggle does that at that point. And they all break, and at that point then the enchantment breaks, and she becomes a serpent and comes after them, and then they kill her. Right, but only at that point, after he breaks the enchantment. But it's his trust in the existence of Aslan and his willingness to harm himself in fidelity to it that breaks the enchantment. And so now Underland's without a queen. They come up from this, and the creatures under it turn out not to have been on her side anyway, because without the queen they could still have this vast army. They're on the wake of doing this. Why not just go out? We find that in fact they had no allegiance to her whatsoever. They were terrified. They were under as much the realm of terror and coercion as was poor Rillian. There's coercion. And once the witch is gone, now they can be freed from that. And in the end, then they rise up from this. And then the story comes to a conclusion, more or less. But that's the thrust of the story. And then the story concludes with a healing of the harms. And one of the harms is Caspian himself does he not become younger here? He dies, first of all. Yes. He dies, and then he's brought back to life by Aslan. Restoring and renewing what had been a terrible harm, the loss of his wife and then the loss of his son. And the way he does heal him is through blood. Go, son of Adam, go into that thicket and pluck the thorn that you'll find there and bring it to me. Eustace obeyed. The thorn was 1 foot long and sharp as a rapier. Drive it into my paw, son of Adam, said Aslan, holding up his right forepaw and spreading it out the great pad towards Eustace. Must I? Said Eustace. Yes, said Aslan. Then Eustace set his teeth and drove the thorn into the lion's pad, and there came out a great drop of blood, redder than all redness that you've ever seen or imagined, and it splashed into the stream over the dead body of the king, it's in the stream. And at that point, the dead king began to be changed. His white beard turned gray, from gray to yellow, got shorter, vanished altogether, becomes a young man, he leaps up and so forth. But it's the blood of the lamb, or blood of the lion here. In the same way that earlier in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It says death, which has the power of breaking the Witch of Narnia, where it's always winter and never Christmas. Same here. It's a restorative thing. So again, but note that's a free offering on Aslan's part. Again, all of the importance of freedom and the magic that comes with that voluntary sacrifice as opposed to coercion. But I'll finish it with that. Next time we come to what I thought we were doing today, which is the Great Divorce. And again, we'll deal then with the portrait of the good and also Lewis's understanding of the Great Divorce between heaven and hell, addressing some of the ways in which it's been misrepresented by his contemporaries.